looking at a passage that we closed with this morning, and that's going to be our starting passage for tonight. We're going to be looking at Joshua 24, beginning in verse 14. This is a lesson that I think it parallels what we've been talking about. When we talked about over that series about come to Jesus, and the question that people ask is why? Well, this, I think, is somewhat parallel. Beginning in Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 14, it says, "Now, therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, and choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." I titled this lesson, I Surrender All. And what we want to talk about today in our lesson, or tonight in our lesson, is how do we surrender our will to God? It's been several months ago. Nathan led a song, and he led that song, "I Surrender All." And after that song, we had a discussion about how challenging it is for us to surrender our will to God, to surrender all to God. If you sing that song and you read the words and you listen to the words, that's hard to do when you talk about surrendering all to God. And so I thought about that, and I asked myself, why? Why is it so hard for me to surrender my life, to surrender my will, to surrender my love to God? And from this, I ended up coming up with 3 questions. And the first question was, what does it mean to surrender my life? What does it mean to surrender my will? What does it mean to surrender my love to God? Well, the first thing I thought about, what does the word surrender mean? What is the definition of surrender? And I just went to Webster's on that and looked up that word, and it says to yield to the power, control, or possession of another upon compulsion or demand. And I thought about it. I thought about that definition, and I thought, well, what does it mean for me to surrender my will to God? And as I was thinking about that, and I thought about the song, I thought about the definition, I thought about all of it, I thought about Genesis. And you may say, well, what does Genesis have to do with surrendering all? What does Genesis have to do with surrender? Well, think about it for a minute. Genesis has everything to do with it. Because when we open our Bible and we read the book of Genesis, and in Genesis 1 it says, "In the beginning God," we have to accept Genesis. We have to do that if we're going to surrender our will to God. In Genesis 1, verse 26, it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And he goes on in verse 27, he says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." You see, we're created by God. From the dust of this earth, God created us. We are the clay. We are the dust of this earth. So why would the clay try to impose its will over the potter? You see, if we don't accept Genesis, then we don't accept that there's a greater authority over us. So if you refuse to accept that, how can you surrender your will to anything? Well, the second thing is what happens when we don't surrender our will to God. Well, the first thing that happens, if we refuse to surrender our will to God's will, then we let sin invade our lives and our hearts. You go back to the passage above in Joshua, he's telling the people that they've been given a choice. They can either serve the idols that their forefathers served, or they can serve God. You see, Joshua, he had seen firsthand the results of not serving God, not surrendering man's will to God's will. We know the story of Moses leading the children children of Israel out of Egypt and through the desert, and how God commanded Moses to go up on top of the mountain, and there he would receive the 10 Commandments. He would give him the commandments that he expected his people to follow. But you see, the faith of the children of Israel, it was weak, and when their leader left, we see how their faith faltered. We see what happened when Moses left the camp. Let's look at that. It's in Exodus 32, beginning in verse 1. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose up early on the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go get down, for your people whom you brought out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation.'" God called his people stiff-necked. They were hard-hearted, and they were weak in their faith. And it said that God's wrath burned after them. God was angry. The second thing that happens when we refuse to surrender our will to God is arrogance overtakes us. Oftentimes, and we read that this morning, we talked about Solomon, oftentimes we presume our blessings that we enjoy are from our own making, and it can be in man's nature to credit himself where he doesn't deserve that credit. Credit belongs to God. The same passage we read this morning was in Deuteronomy 8, verse 10. It says, "When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you this day, lest you, when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold are multiplied, all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land, where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, and that he might test you to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gained me this wealth. That's what arrogance brings. That's what happens when we refuse to surrender our will to God's. And the third thing that happens is we impose our will over God's will. So many times we say we want to serve God, and we make that pronouncement, but so many times we want that service to be on our terms and not God's terms. Look in 2 Kings beginning in chapter 5. 2 Kings 5 beginning in verse 5. We're going to talk a little bit about Naaman. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. The Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. And I think about that, and I think about this young girl's faith and how powerful a young girl, how her faith is so powerful over that of the people around her. And Naaman went in, Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. Obviously, Naaman was held in high esteem by the king, because he said, I'm going to send a letter with you, Naaman. Go, and I'm going to send a letter to this man, to the king of Israel. So he departed, and he took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of leprosy. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive? That this man sends me a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider, see how he seeks a quarrel with me. So it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, and that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. See, Elisha, he didn't even go to the door. He didn't even speak to this man. He sent a servant, he sent a messenger, and he said, just go tell Naaman what to do, and Naaman will be clean. He'll be made well. But Naaman became furious. Now it gives you a little bit of a sense here about Naaman. You know, obviously Naaman was a powerful man. He was held in high esteem by the king. And obviously he was very used to, when he spoke, he expected something done. And he expected it done right now. That's the sense I get when I picture Naaman and his reaction to a servant or a messenger coming with a message that says, go down to the river Jordan and dip 7 times. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. there gives you another insight to Naaman. Naaman, I think he expected pomp and ceremony. He expected something big out of this, a big show. But he didn't get that. That's not what Elisha said. He goes on and he says, "Are not the Abana and the Farfar and the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and he went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he says for you to go wash and be clean?" You see, the Jordan, it wasn't the pristine waters that maybe we have in mind. It was muddy. And when I think of those clear waters, I think of the waters, that flow through the hill country, and you can drive across those waters or walk in those waters and you can see the bottom. I know one time Wanda and I we got the opportunity to go to the Devil's River, and you can look in water that's 15 feet deep, and you can see the rock and the fish on top of the rock at the bottom of the water. It was clean. Or when we were in Montana, we lived up there, the waters were crystal clear, beautiful waters. But that's not what Elisha told him to go do. He said, "You go to the Jordan." So he went down and he dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, and he and all his aides, and he came and stood before him and said, "Indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant." So my question is, when we think about arrogance, I ask this question: did Naaman believe? He did. Naaman believed. Because if he hadn't believed, he wouldn't have gone to his king, and he wouldn't have asked for a letter of reference, so to speak, to the king of Israel. So yes, he believed. So my second question, did he obey? No, not at first. He didn't obey. Not at first. He believed, but he wanted obedience to be on his terms, not God's. Think about that a minute. He wanted obedience to God to be on Naaman's terms, not God's terms. Did Naaman obey? And the answer to that is yes. Finally, he did. And a result of his obedience was his healing. So how often do we want our allegiance to God, our service to God, to be on our terms and not God's terms? Finally, the third thing is how do I surrender all to God? And that's hard. It is hard. I believe that James sums it up in James 4, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasures that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Some may say that doesn't God give us free will to do as we choose? And the answer is yes, God gives us free will. He doesn't force us, just like we said this morning, he doesn't force us to serve him. He doesn't force us to surrender our will to him. But he gives us a choice. I've used this analogy a lot that Dale Rollins used. And the preacher there in San Angelo, he uses this quote. He says, you're free to choose your actions, but you're not free to choose the consequences of those actions. James says that we can't be a friend of the world and still have a relationship with God. He tells us that we have to resist the devil and draw near to God. And when we do that, God will draw near to us. If we want to, if we will but humble ourselves, then we can surrender all to God. If we'll humble ourselves before God and remember and believe Genesis, believe that we are created by God, thus we serve God. God doesn't serve us. And by doing this, we surrender our will to God. Tonight, if there's those that have a need, those that covet the prayers of the church, those that desire to become a member of the Lord's church, if you would come as we stand and sing.